So my name is Michael Zilker, and Cullen Geiselman is my cousin. I asked Cullen for her resume so I could prepare for this introduction, and when it arrived, it became clear that focusing on just its highlights would eat up all of the time allotted to me. So instead, I'm going to focus on Cullen the person, rather than the BAT Ph.D., board member or chair of the Greater Houston Community Foundation, Houston Zoo, Houston Arboretum and Nature Center, the Houston Parks Board, the Houston Advanced Research Center, the Turtle Conservancy, the Lone Star Coastal Alliance, Bats Without Borders, the Rainforest Trust, and Bat Conservation International, where she is the immediate past chair. Cullen also sits on committees at the Menil, the Blaffer Art Museum, the Glassell School at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and was on the board of the Contemporary Arts Museum. I met Cullen properly in January 2011. She had returned to Houston after securing her Ph.D. at Columbia. She was interested in socially conscious investing, and I was involved with renewable energy. I was immediately impressed by how smart Cullen was, but especially taken by how alive, engaged, and caring she seemed. It's extraordinary to consider the mark she has made on Houston, based on all of the organizations listed above, in the 13 years she has been back. We became friends, and once Cullen agreed to join the board of the Turtle Conservancy in Ojai, I got to see firsthand why my wife Nina, who is on the Parks Board with Cullen, would sing her praises as one of their most effective board members. Cullen's expertise is in bats, not turtles, but the governance skills she has acquired on all those boards makes her an essential component of our team. And although she doesn't know it, and after seeing her resume, I am concerned whether she will have the bandwidth, I have just been asked to see if she would chair our board. So Cullen is a powerhouse, but even more importantly, she is a fabulous person. And in March of last year, she married her soulmate, Robert Muse. Cullen is so accomplished that it was hard for her to find an equal partner, and 2 years ago that happened. Nina and I love hanging out, watching films, and going to hear music with Cullen and Robert. I know this event is focused on women in science, but I mention this because I think one of Cullen's greatest strengths is that she is such a full person with a rich and varied life, and I don't think she would be able to excel as a scientist if this weren't the case. So it is my pleasure to introduce Cullen, who will share some of the challenges she has faced as a woman in science.
I'm so thrilled to chat with you guys today, and because I have to say, was my mentor has taught me too, that each picture is worth at least 1,000 words. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about my journey to becoming a scientist and sort of how I got to this sort of not academic area of my life, which I doubted myself quite a lot until when you fail enough, then you're like, well, it's really not that bad. Anyway, so my journey and my passion really arose probably where it really got directed in high school. But as a small child, I was very focused on animals, and I was very mission-oriented. And there I am. I might be 5. My mom dug up this picture for me last night, and everywhere I went, had my hamster, and was really dedicated to all animals and all pets and everything, and was ready to go on a mission. But really, my directed journey focused on the environment, started with this woman. This is Catherine Leatham. She was my high school biology teacher at the Kincaid School, and she taught this class called Gulf Coast Crisis. And I'm not even sure at 15 if I even realized I lived in the Gulf Coast. I lived in Texas, and I'm not sure if I really understood where Houston was. I mean, in relation to, I hadn't really given a lot of thought. And we got to go on field trips, and the first field trip, the first morning, we get in the van, and she takes us to a BFI landfill and says, y'all, this is where your garbage goes. Next day, we went to a sewage treatment plant. This is what happens when you flush the toilet. And then throughout a 3-week course, she showed us like the environmental issues with our community and where they start and where they go and what that impact was. She also took us out to prairies and told us about native plants. And she just had such an impact on me. I had no idea. She opened my eyes. And that's what ultimately led me to my undergraduate degree, which was at Duke University and the Nicholas School of the Environment. I did a degree in environmental science and policy. And part of the reason I wasn't a biology major is so I didn't have to take physics, just to be totally honest. And I'm sure other students understand that. And but that was really where my passion was. And I had the joy of spending, one of the nice things about Duke University, pretty much all the juniors go abroad. Somehow they find a way to get you to go abroad. And I went to Costa Rica, and I studied with the School of Field Studies, and I studied sustainable development. And that's where, walking through tropical forests, I just looked up and I was like, it's trees, it's plants. And I really got interested in botany. I really thought this is where I really wanted to be. But I also spent a summer, I'm from Houston, I spent a summer working for free at the Houston Zoo while I was in college. And here I am in my little Houston Zoo outfit. I kind of look different, but not totally. And working in the world of primates, I got to be really close to animals. And I thought, well, this is really interesting. I cut up a lot of fruit all day and I clean up a lot of poo. And I could do this. That could be a career choice. But I had a really hard time getting direction from from what I could do as a career. And I was really sort of bouncing around. I could be a scientist, maybe not. What else was I going to do? I got my first paid internship down in Clear Lake at the Environmental Institute of Houston, studying outdoor classrooms and how students engage with the outdoors in school and cataloging those. And that was pretty interesting. And then ultimately, I landed a job after I graduated from undergrad with Bat Conservation International. Totally random. It was not botany. I got rejected. I wrote all these letters to botanical gardens and I couldn't get a job. So, but that was fine. I was young. I was like, sure, I can do this. I can teach people about bats. I have to always show a couple good pictures of bats. 80% of all the bats in the world are insectivorous. And over a fifth of all mammal species are bats. And they're doing cool stuff like specializing on eating frogs. And there's a bat in Costa Rica. Or fully carnivorous bats that eat birds and other bats. And then the bats that I studied, those that disperse seeds in the rainforest or that are like little hummingbirds and pollinate plants. And Bat Conservation International let me, at 22 to 26 years old, go all around the world teaching people about bats. I taught workshops, taught people how to study bats and do all this stuff. And here I am in Kenya, and this is a very old photo and sort of hard to see in this light. And I have a little bat. We all wear gloves and masks now. But back then we did not. We handled them and did all sorts of stuff. Only very special people get to see pictures of me holding bats barehanded. But that other guy next to me is Peter Taylor, and he was a Ph.D. scientist that they flew up from South Africa because I didn't have the credentials to actually go around and tell people, oh, we really caught this bat and not that bat, because I wasn't a specialist in African bat taxonomy. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then the next year, I got to go to Brazil. And I went on a really interesting trip to Brazil where we went to these cattle ranches and places right along what they call the Arc of Destruction, where they're cutting down the Amazon forest, burning it, and putting cattle into pastures, and then shipping them off to China in the end, or their body parts, for people to eat. And these fires, it reminded me so much of all the things I studied with Catherine Leatham back in high school, and was like, oh my God. I was also reading this book at the time called The Song of the Dodo, and it's about island biogeography in our time of extinctions. And this author is fantastic. He's a new board member with me on a board, and I'm nearly passed out when I first got to meet him. But he wrote all about these amazing scientists and the work they did and how it all added up to this amazing interest, like people in the Amazon, people in Papua New Guinea, all over the world, studying animals, studying how humans impact on the environment, and it was really compelling. And then later that year, I got to be in Brazil in the Rio Negro for work. I was co-leading a trip with the New York Botanical Garden and Bat Conservation International, looking at bats as a natural history tour, and I met this man who later became my Ph.D. advisor. This is Scott Morey, who was the chair of systematic botany at the New York Botanical Garden. And he was looking for a student that knew something about bats and can capture bats and identify bats, and he was ready to take me on. He said, you get to choose. I'm affiliated with a number of universities. I'm adjunct at 3 in New York. You choose what school you want to go to. And I chose to go to Columbia. And it was a new department, the Ecology, Evolution, Environmental Biology department. And what was so interesting to me about this, instead of doing a PhD in 6 years, which you do your master's and PhD, you got to add a 7th year and study environmental policy, environmental law, economics of the environment. And because they had decided at Columbia that they were tired of trying to teach science to policymakers, and that maybe we should just teach some policymaking to scientists, and maybe they would step up and do some policy work. And I office at the New York Botanical Garden with my PhD advisor. And I didn't get to go to Brazil and the Arc of Destruction to study bats and whatnot. I got to go to French Guiana, which I didn't know where that was. It's in northern South America. And it's where my PhD advisor had been working with many, many people for many years to write the vascular plants of central French Guiana. That man knows every plant in central French Guiana. And he said, this is going to be easier if you want to study bats and plants. And this is where my work is. So you'll be working here. And it was a really amazing place. We went to this research station called the Nurag Research Station, and it's run by essentially their National Science Foundation, the CNRS, and it was pretty rudimentary. The accommodation is truly in a rainforest, a lowland rainforest, and there was nobody for 100 miles around, just forest. And you got to helicopter there because that was way better than taking a 2-hour bus from Cayenne and an 8-hour boat ride up the river with no shade, and then an 8-kilometer hike with all your things up to the research station, 30 minutes in a helicopter. It's my favorite mode of transportation now. It's great. There we are unloading the helicopter at the research station, and we live pretty basically. Hammocks. There was no toilet. We did have some running water. And this was the other thing that I really wanted to do. And I'm not sure if I ever really meant it to him. I just wanted to live deep in the rainforest and just really be with nature. And you really start changing your mind about that because nature itches. And it's humid and you're sticky all the time and you smell bad all the time. And anyway, you learn that that's different. But I really did get to see a lot of nature while I was there. And I was there. I was doing my PhD research, which was I was studying actually there are 4 species of sympatric, meaning they all live together in the same place. Glossophagian, meaning they have long tongues and look like little hummingbirds, types bats that lived in this pristine rainforest. Why were there 4 species that look essentially just alike? These are only 3. There was one that's very rare that was never captured. They essentially, you can kind of see them, just alike. What are they all doing there, and what are they doing something different? And so I spent a lot of time, 4 o'clock in the morning, by myself in the middle of nowhere in the rainforest, catching bats in mist nets, sort of like bird nets. And I'd put them in little bags. They would poop, and then I could look at their poop under a microscope and see what kind of pollen it was from my pollen collection that I identified using that fancy book that my PhD advisor and all his colleagues had written. And I did that for 2 years. I also did stuff like get into the canopy to find out most of these bats, like where were they going? Where were these flowers? And so here I am, and I started thinking about, while I was doing all this hardcore work, when I was younger, I really thought, you know what? I want to meet Indiana Jones, and I'm going to marry him. I wanted to be her. But you know what? I'm dangling off a tree, and I was like, screw her. I'm him. And I became him. And then little Cully came back, and I was like, you know what? I don't need an Indiana Jones. I can do this myself, and here I am, doing it and doing a lot of studies. And I'm going to skip past this because I'm going to run out of time. This is a film of me, the actual film that we took in that tree of a bat going to this plant. But it's about an hour, or a minute of just some, I don't know how well. Well, we can try, actually. Let's see. Do y'all want to see? Y'all want to see what this looks like? A bat coming to a plant? Let's see. Where's my mouse? Oh, it's going. They started it for me. So those little things where the arrow is that look like green beans, those are flowers, and they're popping open. This is in light that is, I have my special light on it so we can actually see it at night. It's sort of in an infrared. And literally 4 minutes after the flower opens, a bat arrives. That's a bat. They move really fast. And then there's little movement, and those are ants. They're going to, and so, oh, the bat's back. Don't worry, I'm going to slow it down here in a second. Oh, moving fast, moving fast. He'll come back. Imagine many, many hours of this, like hundreds. So here's the slow-mo. There he is. There he is. I had some lovely students. 3 different students watch hundreds of hours of that for some studies. And then y'all are be real excited about what we learned. What we learned is that these bats, these 2 bats that look very similar, they're slightly different in size. Well, they're pretty much eating very much similar. These are plant species on the y-axis, or on the x-axis of what they're eating. There are a few things that are slightly different, but generally, these bats are generally doing the same thing. I looked at it over time. Well, sometimes there's 80% overlap in their diet. Sometimes there's only 30%, but they're kind of doing the same thing. And then I was like, well, maybe there's just a lack of fit. Like maybe the bigger bat, like this guy, he can stick his nose in those flowers, the more on the left side, the bell-shaped flowers, and maybe the little one can't. Or maybe the little one just really likes this. It went multiple times whenever this particular caryocar plant flowered. It went there, it seemed. At least that's what I found from this. Could be flower constancy. Could be foraging behavior. The little bats seemed to mainly be focusing on plants that were found above the canopy. Most of stuff I could not see because I only had so many cameras up and looking at it. And so I decided to really look at this plant. It was the dominant tree species, Epiruta falcata. It doesn't really have a real name. It was the main food group in the dry season, right there. And both bats are feeding on it all the time, and lots of other things turned out where it has this pretty flower. There they are, dangling down. And so up 100 feet in the canopy, we decided to cover up some of these flowers and keep some nocturnal visitors away and some diurnal visitors away. And then we also were filming the plants. And we wanted to see what would set fruit, depending on what visitors came. So this is very hard for you to see because it was very hard for my students to see when they were looking at all this video. Hummingbirds came to the plants, moths came to the plants. That lump in the middle, D, that's a monkey. We're coming to these plants. And then we got the data, and guess what? Everybody's coming to these plants. They're one of the main things out there. Bees, bats, hummingbirds. They're all sort of seem to be coming to these plants. Looked at the fruiting success of the plants based on, was it pollinated during the day or during the night, or did we just pollinate it with itself? Well, everybody's kind of making fruit. And so the big takeaways to my research was that these bats are feeding on similar things all the time, but maybe in differently proportions, somewhat. And then the dominant plant that they're visiting actually doesn't rely on them for pollination. And so nature is just a big old mess. It's a lot easier to do this in the lab. And it's also a lot easier to not do it by yourself. And so my Ph.D. advisor's work that I was also doing, well, that got done. We wrote a book, Seed Dispersal by Bats in the Neotropics. That happened. And here my co-author and my Ph.D. advisor are on one of our trips. And our big takeaways from a 300-page book are bats are important seed dispersers in the Neotropics. But how they are important and where, that kind of it's just kind of different. And I had all this great data. I was going to do a bunch of other stuff. I tried to do 3 different postdocs. First guy didn't get tenure, left Rice. The other woman came up from Mexico and brought her children, though her husband didn't appreciate that. So she got in trouble for kidnapping, and then she couldn't be here anymore. And then the number 1 bat biologist in the world that was at Boston University, he took me on to do a postdoc, and we were going to study bat seed dispersal in India as ecosystem services. He literally got hit by a car. And then I stopped trying to do all that stuff. But what I did have was my family in Houston. So during all this time, I'd moved back to Houston for these knuckleheads because I lived here, and it was better than the Bronx at the time because the Bronx in the winter's kind of rough. And I took over what my mom had been doing a long time, the Cullen Trust for Healthcare, which is a supporting organization that funds healthcare initiatives in the greater Houston area. And they've done a lot of work. And she said, "You're going to love this." And I was like, "Well, Mom, can't it just be like environmental health care?" And she said, "No." And because that's not what we do. And so I really got deep into healthcare. I learned a lot about healthcare. I got to ask a lot of questions. And I got to work on my database, which is what I inherited from my Ph.D. advisor about all those bat-plant interactions. Well, it's become all sorts of interactions. It's become bat interactions, not just with plants, but where bats live. What eats bats? What lives on bats? Look at that scary thing. Anyhow, and this is in my database, and we've expanded it, and it became very popular during the pandemic because the coronavirus that has now infected and become a human-dominated disease was actually evolved from one that came out of bats. In my database of all these interactions with bats and all these other things and where they live and what they do, well, people said, this is interesting. And now I have all these collaborators. I have people working with me all the time. And so this work that I've been doing for 20 years on my own now actually has a pretty big audience and is really beginning to take off. So you never really know. So now, as Michael explained, I sit on a lot of boards, and I've learned this from chairing the board of the Cullen Trust for Healthcare. And I chaired the board, Bat Conservation International Board, after having been a staff person. You know a lot when you've been a staff person, then you become a board member, and really helped get that organization going in a good direction post-founder. I've served on the Houston Zoo Board after all that great zoo poo cleaning and everything that I did in college, and we've turned that from a place for family entertainment into the largest environmental educator in the state of Texas. And the number of kids that come and get a conservation message at the zoo is incredible. I have just recently rolled off as being chair of the board of the Houston Arboretum and Nature Center. And they really didn't need me though I give bat walks there, they didn't really need me for my scientific prowess, but I knew a lot about boards at this point. I serve on the HARC board, which is just up in the Woodlands. And that's been pretty interesting. And this was not my plan. We have a new board that might finally take off after 12 years, the Lone Star Coastal Alliance. We want to create a national recreation area in the Galveston Bays, and it might just start happening. As Michael said, I serve with his wife Nina on the Houston Parks Board, and we are bringing park equity across Houston with the Bayou Greenways and with our investment in neighborhood parks that have not been invested in a long time. And I serve with Michael on the Turtle Conservancy Board, and I'll show you a picture in just a moment, and you'll see my contribution to diversity on that board. And now recently Rainforest Trust. So there's rainforests in Costa Rica that I loved and really opened my mind. I'm now with a group in directing about $50 million worth of funding every year to save our rainforest for humans and for nature. So here I am with the Turtle Conservancy Board, and I was their diversity first woman on the board, and everyone listened to me. I feel like I don't have a whole lot of challenges. My biggest challenge was self-doubt in many different ways. And I'm also short. In most of the boards I was on, I was the youngest person, and I was a woman, and I'm like 5 feet nothing. And so when you have someone say, you need to do blah, 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 and they here, I think she just might have suggested that perhaps that we might consider, and I'm like, no, you need to blah, blah, blah. You need to do your audit, or you need to blah, blah, whatever. And, but I have to say that I've learned a lot about turtles on this turtle board. And on the zoo board, what we've realized is that conservation, and maybe this is what I didn't really need to probably get a Ph.D. I learned a lot, and people do like to see that Cullen, Geiselman, Muse, Ph.D. is coming to talk to them, and they respect me. But what we found at the Houston Zoo, this is me on a panel at the American Zoological Association conference, and we talked about culture and conservation culture, and there's not one conservationist up there. I was a zoo board member. We had the director of admissions, director of advancement, and the director of HR. And guess what? All of this work requires everyone working together. And every single one of us up there is a conservationist. Even though I happen to have the PhD, every single one of us is doing the work. And it takes all kinds. It takes HR to get this done. And so here I am at the zoo back in my day. And then I got the joy of co-chairing their capital campaign for $150 million. And if you haven't been to the zoo in a while, you should go. It's not far away from here. And here it is, the Pantanal, some of the same places I was in Brazil. And we have a new wonderful exhibit highlighting these wonderful people, true conservationists from the country of origin in Brazil. They didn't need an American. This is the world's largest living armadillo. Weighs like 60 pounds. Lives in the Pantanal. You can't see it at the Houston Zoo, only a statue. They don't do well in captivity. Anyway, it's been a joy and a real interest in doing all this. And most recently, I have fused and it's just someone just asked me to do it. And I did it. My love of wildlife and the environment with human health. And we published a book called One Health in the Exposome. And again, I feel like I'm a good relayer of information to people to engage them in science. And my ability to do science in nature is really hard. And the results that you get, people don't want to publish in a really good journal, which is not really good for your academic career, but it doesn't have to be academia. And I'm just going to leave you with that. So.